able to see you.
Okay. We got Ben on the screen.
Hello, Isaiah.
Hello.
Nice to see you again.
Yeah. All right. Well, we read from chapter 8 to chapter 15, entitled The Beginning, this week. So I don't know, last week I tried to kind of go chapter by chapter. That was kind of slow and painful. So maybe if you've read it and things stood out to you, we can talk about those things. Or we could just go chapter to chapter, whatever works for y'all best. Were you guys able to read it?
I didn't get a chance to.
No. Okay, so just my mom and I, because Carol read it 30 years ago. So that means that if there's anything you want to draw attention to or ask questions about, we can. But I can also just kind of go chapter by chapter. So
Could we spend some time at some point, David, discussing Lewis as a writer? Sort of the way you would look at it from an English studies point of view. His style and the effect on what he's saying and that kind of thing. Because this is a book where it really hits me that his style is, I think because it's so personal, I find it much easier to relate to.
Okay.
And I also find his style in this is more poetic. It has more simile and metaphor than his other books. I just find it really quite a different volume.
okay. So besides those statements, did you need me to say something or?
Well, I don't know. I don't know whether that struck anybody else or it's just because that was my English major years ago. But
just, you know, Carol is pedaling, which is to strengthen her feet. So if you hear noises and see her moving like that, that's because she's pedaling away there.
I'm pedaling fast now.
Yes, she's going uphill.
Slowly.
Nice.
Usually I have this done before group, but didn't work out that way today.
It's quite all right.
Yeah.
So, so I don't really, just in terms of interacting with what you've said, Carol, I don't feel any need to disagree. But then again, I realize that you and I read Lewis differently at different places. So, but I'm happy to hear what it is you see, and that your reading of this book 30 years ago was good for you.
Oh, it was very good for me.
Okay.
I think maybe it was the first Lewis I read.
Okay.
And because I was so struck by it, perhaps some of the others were a bit more disappointing.
Okay.
Although I love his children's stories.
Yeah.
Like as an adult.
Yeah.
I love his children's stories.
Yeah. So for me, I see, even as I was reading these chapters this week, just seeing so many roots to things that he's written that we've read together, that I can go, oh, okay, that's where I can see that peeking out, you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I noticed quite a bit of that.
Yeah.
Where does this fit in the, like, in his library or?
Chronologically?
Yeah.
Let us
That's
turn
the right
to the
word.
copyright page. This is 1955. So in terms of where that would fit within other things that he's written that's post-war, so I think he's written like Mere Christianity, and a lot of what we've read. Though not Great Divorce yet, because I think that was 64, but I'm not 100% sure. So, yeah,
Well, like in the front of my book, it has books by C.S. Lewis, and they usually list them in publication order, but I don't know whether that's the case or
right,
not. But if it is the case, it's the second to last book.
right,
What's the last one, Mary?
Not counting the children's books.
right. And that always is if it's the same publisher, because there are times where it's different publishers.
Yeah, this is from Fount Paperbacks or something.
Yeah, so HarperCollins has a lot of his now.
Yeah, HarperCollins.
So.
Okay.
Well, we in chapter 8, we continue to have this relationship between Lewis and his dad. And it was a frustration. So that sense of divide continues to be there. No matter what he would say, his dad would hear his own thing and respond to what he heard. This confidence that it didn't matter what you said, he could read between the lines and know what was really being said, and then talk about that. And so that just drove Lewis crazy. So
I think that would drive anybody crazy.
right. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, you can't talk. You can't talk to the guy
Yeah.
about anything.
Yeah.
I know a lot of fathers like that.
I suppose. I've not had the
I hear a lot of people say that about their father. It was certainly true of my English grandfather.
Okay. So he's writing this, of course, from a point of view of history. So while he's frustrated or recollecting his old frustration, he's also being graceful as he can, and recognizing that part of the frustration was his own youth, and that in that situation he may have committed his own sins, but he kind of just comes back to this point of, but at the same time, the sensations are the sensations. I mean, I experienced what I experienced, so he's trying to be gracious. So his dad became kind of a frustrating presence to him and his brother, and wanted to be with them, but inevitably would ruin those things that they were enjoying. So he gives this wonderful kind of example of they're sitting outside reading, and he comes and he says, well, I'll join you. And then he puts on a raincoat and then says, shouldn't we sit over here? And they sit over here, and then he's baking in the sun, and he says, shouldn't we go inside because it's so hot? And so their contentedness was just shattered. But he also recognizes from that point of view that his father needed their companionship. But part of his point is that he and his brother both continue to enjoy that solitary life. They're not looking for a lot of company.
Well, I think you
Seems
really see
slowly-
that in the next couple of chapters, where he's talking about his studies with the Professor Kirk.
Yeah,
or whatever his name is.
yeah,
And how his days have the routine.
yes.
I could really relate to that. It was like, oh, I love that. I would love that. I would just love that. And
Yes,
that to me, that's I could see why he valued that so much.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
especially the walk and come home and have your tea and your crumpets and your books waiting
Yeah.
for you.
yeah,
When I was a kid, um, it's Ben, right? Ben and Isaiah. Yeah, I didn't have the happiest childhood, and um, the the more you could avoid my mother, the better. She was a single parent, so I spent a lot of time in my room reading and listening to my records and stuff like that, quite very quietly. Yeah, so I
yes.
can relate.
So, yeah, we do have him. Sorry, Ben, you were gonna ask or say something.
The dad seems so unaware of himself, and
Right.
then thus unaware of anybody around him.
Right,
Kind of fits together.
In the beginning, you can notice like his like disconnection to his emotions. Like it starts off as like angry and like shoots out both ways.
right,
But now you can see he's like not in his mind, probably it's maturing in his emotions
right,
by becoming like almost delusional to them.
right, right.
But to us and like Lewis's, it's like you're becoming immature because you're not actually
Right.
feeling them or like feeling them out.
Yeah, yeah,
I don't know.
yeah,
That's what I noticed. It's like he probably thinks he's maturing by just not recognizing them, but
yes,
in that matter, immature because he's being more like a child and like
right.
not recognizing them.
Yeah, yeah, almost trying to enter into a second boyhood to hang
Yeah.
out with his sons.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Um, and then he does go to Mr. Kirkpatrick, which is, you're right, Mum, is where Professor Kirk from the books come.
Mhm.
Um, but he also makes a friend in Arthur. And so that's the kid who was in his neighborhood that tried to make friends, and they kind of repelled it. However, when he was sick, when Arthur was sick, Lewis went over to see him. He says, for some reason, I don't know what led me to accept the invitation, but for some reason I did. And then he finds Arthur sitting up in bed, and on the table is a copy of Myths of the Norsemen, very thing that Lewis had fallen in love with and had started to read it. And so the conversation goes, "Do you like that?" said I. "Do you like that?" said he. Next moment, the book was in our hands. Our heads were bent close together. We were pointing, quoting, talking, soon almost shouting, discovering in a torrent of questions that we liked not only the same thing, but the same parts of it, and in the same way, that both knew the stab of joy, and that for both, the arrow was shot from the north. Many thousands of people have had the experience of finding the first friend, and it is nonetheless a wonder, as great a wonder as first love, or even a greater. So he discovers another like himself. Later on, he'll describe him as an alter ego, almost a duplicate of himself, this friend. And so he gets to know himself a little better through this friend.
It's kind of interesting, like his like how he latches onto like that Norse mythology and like kind of that almost like imaginary world where there's not really boundaries and limits. And like you
Mhm.
think of all of his story, like at least Narnia is kind of, well, there's lots of similarities to that Norse mythology. When I've kind of looked at the Norse mythology, and there is similarities
Yeah.
to like the stories and the heroes and like
Yes,
kings and queens, and
yes,
it's kind of cool to see.
yeah, yeah. So he leaves school and he goes to Mr. Kirkpatrick. And he's known as the Great Knock, which is chapter 9. And we must relate some of this stuff. So we have so he's come prepared because his father has described this man in certain terms, sentimental, emotional terms. This picture of this teacher pulling his father aside and quite naturally and quietly slid his arm round him and rubbed his dear old whiskers against my father's youthful cheek and whispered a few words of comfort. And now Lewis is meeting him, and of course, that idea is terrifying for somebody who is just shuns and shudders away from the emotional. To have a man that would do this. He was over 6 feet tall, shabbily dressed, lean as a rake, immensely muscular. His wrinkled face consisted entirely of muscles. He wore mustache and side whiskers with a clean-shaven chin like the Emperor Franz Joseph. The whiskers concern me very much at that moment. And so then the conversation starts. A few minutes later, we were walking away from the station. You are now, said Kirk, proceeding along the principal artery between Great and Little Bookham. I stole a glance at him. Was this geographical exordium or a heavy joke, or was he trying to conceal his emotions? His face, however, showed only an inflexible gravity. I began to make conversation in the deplorable manner which I had acquired at those evening parties, and indeed found increasingly necessary to use with my father. I said I was surprised at the scenery of Surrey. It was much wilder than I had expected. Stop! Shouted Kirk with a suddenness that made me jump. What do you mean by wildness, and what grounds had you for not expecting it? I replied, I don't know what, still making conversation. And answer after answer was torn to shreds. It at last dawned upon me that he really wanted to know. He was not making conversation, not joking, not snubbing me. He wanted to know. I was stung into attempting a real answer. A few passes sufficed to show that I had no clear, indistinct idea corresponding to the word wildness, and that insofar as I had any idea at all, wildness was a singularly inept word. Do you not see, then, concluded the Great Knock, that your remark was meaningless? I prepared to sulk a little, assuming that the subject would now be dropped. Never was I more mistaken in my life. Having analyzed my terms, Kirk was proceeding to deal with my proposition as a whole. On what had I based, but he pronounced it based, my expectations about the flora and geology of Surrey? Was it maps or photographs or books? I could produce none. It had, heaven help me, never occurred to me that what I called my thoughts needed to be based on anything. Kirk once more drew a conclusion, without the slightest sign of emotion, but equally without the slightest concession to what I thought good manners. Do you not see, then, that you had no right to have any opinion whatever on the subject? By this time, our acquaintance had lasted about 3.5 minutes, but the tone set by this first conversation was preserved without a single break during all the years I spent at Bookham. I remember reading that, not quite 30 years ago, but long enough ago, and just thinking, holy jumping, if that's the first 3.5 minutes, what is 3 years like? So he goes on to say that this man was the closest he's ever met to a pure logical entity.
Mm.
The loud cry of stop was flung in arrest of a torrent of verbiage which could not be endured a moment longer, not because it fritted his patience, but because it was wasting time, darkening counsel. The hastier and quieter excuse, as in excuse me, ushered in a correction or distinction, merely parenthetical, and betokened that, thus set right, your remark might still, without absurdity, be allowed to reach completion. The most encouraging of all was, I hear you. This meant that your remark was significant and only required refutation. It had risen to the dignity of error. Now, Lewis says that some boys would not have liked it. To me, it was red beef and strong beer. So it's the right teacher with the right pupil. Lewis had a very particular kind of mind. School was an absolute torment. Even the teachers that he had, that he liked or respected or did well with him, did not have probably the level of impact and formation that Kirk does. Although he does come to recognize later that Kirk also lacks some things that others. That's probably, we should just talk about Kirk there. What do you want to say?
Is he the high school? Is this high school that he's going to, or is this like more a university type?
I think this would be in preparation for going to university. So it would have been in the upper forms, I guess. Yeah. Yeah, I'm not exactly aware of the British system. I
that's why
think
it's
you
like,
kind of go
okay.
through elementary and then you sit exams, which tells you if you can continue on to study or if you just need to start working in a trade or something.
Yeah,
And I think so. I think he did that, and that's what Wyvern was. And now he's left that school to finish up that level of education prior
Okay.
to going to Oxford.
okay.
Yeah.
He's very like a strong, like he clearly is a directive character.
Yes.
Like
yes.
I think he's supposed to
And
like
Kirkpatrick is Scottish, and Scottish are well known for their really plain common sense.
Yeah.
So that kind of high logical, no nonsense cut across you would be in some ways, I mean, it's personality, but there would be also a measure of formation. Yeah.
What they would have valued as a culturally,
Well, some would.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, you've got an Irishman going to a Scotsman in England. So
Yeah.
how valued that would have been, I don't know. But for Lewis, he says, no doubt I snorted and bridled. So that's breaking a horse. Snorted and bridled a little at some of my tossings, but taking it all in all, I loved the treatment. After being knocked down sufficiently often, I began to know a few guards and blows, so that's sword play, and to put on intellectual muscle. Interesting. Kirkpatrick has muscle in the face, almost all muscle in the face. Maybe Lewis is now getting some muscle in his face.
Yeah.
Maybe a little bit metaphoric. So this is just, you might say, his style of teaching, the way it worked for him.
see it show up in like in Muircraft Christianity, I think of what we've read so far, that like
Yeah.
clear follow through,
Oh, yes.
consistent, rigorous.
Yeah.
I kind of, I've sewed down it's,
Yeah. Clarify the terms. What do you mean by that?
yeah,
Understand the propositions and then does this reach the conclusion? Yeah,
Yeah, as I read this, I can sort of imagine that, him thinking through those arguments and going, well, okay, well, I need to explain what I mean by this. Why does that connect to that? How would somebody respond and how can I
Yeah.
anticipate those responses?
that's
and-
right, yeah, yeah, yeah. Logic is linear.
Like chess.
That's right, yeah,
It's like a chess game
yes.
Yeah.
where you have to guess what the opponent is going to do.
Right,
I had a teacher in high school like that who only worked with bright kids because that's all he liked.
right,
And for most of the year, those of us in his little inner circle had no idea what he was about.
yeah,
Nothing that we did ever seemed to be it.
right,
And he just pushed and pushed and pushed.
yeah,
And by the end of the year, we were just starting to catch on to what he was about.
yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. So, when a very dignified neighbor in the course of a Sunday call observed with an air of finality, well, Mr. Kirkpatrick, it takes all sorts to make a world. You are a liberal and I am a conservative. We naturally look at the facts from different angles. Kirk replied, what do you mean? You asking me to picture liberals and conservatives playing peep-boo at a rectangular fact from opposite sides of a table? If an unwary visitor hoping to waive a subject observed, of course, I know opinions differ. Kirk would raise both hands and exclaim, good heavens, I have no opinions on any subject whatsoever. A favorite maxim was, you can have enlightenment for 9 pence, but you prefer ignorance. uh,
Not open to divergent thinking.
no, well, I mean,
No,
not easily. He's not going to make it easy on you for sure. And
Kirk,
sorry,
Kirk-
go ahead.
Kirk kind of reminds me of Miss Simonson.
Okay.
She was my high school teacher and like kind of same idea, like what our class was like 7 people and
Oh,
we're
yeah.
all like students who all had like 99s all through school and everything.
Okay.
And like I was very good at writing like a lot of words and throwing big facts and big words and like impressing other teachers.
She could, yeah.
And I was thoroughly surprised of how low my mark was on my first paper.
Yes.
And I was like, I've never seen a mark this low in my
Yeah,
entire
yeah, yeah.
life.
Yeah.
She's like, Isaiah, you could fill 30, like my last paper I wrote for her was 30 pages. And she was like, Isaiah, the first year I taught you, she started teaching me in grade 10. And she worked with like, there's like 7 or 8 of us.
Yeah.
All through high school. We did like science together. We did all of our classes together pretty much.
Yeah. So
And
cohort.
she was like, the first time, if I would ask you to write this paper in grade 10, you would have probably written like 40 or 50 pages. This is 20 pages, and this is miles better than your 50 page you could have written.
Right.
It's kind of the same idea. She's like, why are you? I would just like try to like do the same thing that Lewis would do is like
Yes.
throw a bunch of words around and make it sound smart and like
Yeah.
try and like, yeah, have dialogue.
Yes.
And
Yes.
she'd been, it kind of makes you think of Kirk like a very
Yeah.
direct character that wants you to actually like
Yes.
think about what you're writing down.
Yes. And there's parallels in Anna Green Gables and gets a beloved teacher, Miss Stacy. Miss Stacy, as she works with the upper form to prepare them for the Queen's entrance exams, just pushes Anne to choose smaller, simpler words and just edit, cut. It just, I mean, Anne was verbose, right? And so that painful, so that's a real gift
Yeah.
that you had a teacher like that.
Yeah. And I mean, my papers by the end, like I got still continue to have high grades on my papers, but definitely like short and more importance in every paragraph. Like
Yeah,
every paragraph had like not just ramble of facts of like throwing
right.
numbers and like statements and quotes around, but actually like meaningfully breaking down like one quote instead of throwing 3 quotes
Right.
around.
Yeah.
I don't know. I just
Yeah.
think that's interesting.
It was sharper. It was good. He was Professor Kirkpatrick was a Presbyterian, again Scottish. Now he's an atheist. And though he still dresses for the Sabbath.
Yeah.
And he was a good atheist, not like the atheism of Lewis's day. It was a solid atheist. So Lewis, as an ex-atheist, can kind of look at the stuff that people would send him as a Christian to kind of promote atheism, and Lewis would just think, oh, this is nothing. You should have met Professor Kirkpatrick. And then he talks about the way that he learned. And for me, as I study Greek for my New Testament studies, I really appreciate when he says, those in whom the Greek word lives only while they are hunting for it in the lexicon, and who then substitute the English word for it, are not reading the Greek at all. They are only solving a puzzle. The very formula nous means a ship is wrong. Nous and ship both mean a thing. They do not mean one another. Behind nous is as behind navis or naka. We want to have a picture of a dark, slender mass with sail or oars climbing the ridges, with no officious English word intruding. Does that make sense to you?
Did you get there, Dave?
No, I am still not there.
Well, you see, you have to be left in a room alone after 3 sessions of teaching you. To
Yes,
just do it on your own.
but
Apparently.
he's also
That's the
doing it in
formula.
a very different way. So, I mean,
Mhm.
Kirkpatrick sat down, reads 30 lines out of the Greek, and then leaves Lewis to do the same, right? So it's very different than translating a verse, for a sermon or something. Like, the whole goal for Lewis at that point was to actually learn Greek.
Read the Greek, yeah.
The goal for New Testament Greek study is usually to be able to translate the Bible. It's a very different animal.
Mm.
It does present an interesting sort of, if you relate that to Bible translation, like you can see where
Mhm.
that differs.
Yes, very much so.
From, you're right, we try and pick some keywords or key
Yeah.
passages that oftentimes focusing on a single word.
Yeah. And that, I mean, they both have their place. And it doesn't have to be either or. I would love to be able to just pick up the New Testament and read.
Yeah.
And I can do it a little bit because I've been working on it for a long, long time. Well, then he describes his day, ideal day, that he doesn't often get. And you just realize what a mind he has, because he's doing Greek, Latin, German, French. You're just like, holy jumping. And then to find out that he's not as proficient as some others would be in that. He also learns to read thanks to Arthur, his friend, some of the English literature, and to appreciate it.
Gilead would kind
The
of
other
give,
sort of interesting stuff that I've noticed, you just talking sort of in a general way, is how he was able to kind of compartmentalize his life.
Yes.
Again, this is something I understand fairly well.
Yes.
I mean, he knew he was going to go to war
Yes.
when this was over.
Yes.
This training, session was over. But he was able to just put that aside as though it didn't exist.
Yeah. So
And
that's chapter 10. Yeah.
yeah, that was one thing that hit me. And the other was how he talks about and he references it more than once through the book, how he sees a thread of God pursuing him for a long time,
Right, yes,
even when he was a kid.
yes.
Mhm.
Yeah, and this is the book. He says it in two different places in a couple different ways, but it's one of my favorite ideas from him that the atheist can never be too careful in the world because God is always setting traps for him.
That's right.
And at one point, he says the atheist must be very careful what he picks up and reads.
Yeah, like George MacDonald's work.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
yeah,
I
yeah,
have to go read that guy. That's about the 5th time that name has come up
yes,
for me.
absolutely.
So
Yeah,
gotta go read it.
It's kind of interesting how he talks about his like atheism and all those things. Because lots of times when you hear people talk about it, it's kind of like this super dark, negative time in your life, and then all of a
Yes.
sudden it flips when you become a Christian.
right.
And for him, he's talking about almost in like this, and then this happened, like almost like it's not that it like plateaued his life upwards or anything,
That's right, yeah.
but almost this thing that just kind of moved forward in his life. And I think that's an interesting way to talk about it because it's like your life doesn't get better when you become a Christian. Like you have the promise and hope of God,
Yeah,
but it's not like your life in your moment, in your situation. Like it's not like all of a sudden $1 million pops in your bank account or something.
right.
Like
Yeah, yeah,
I kind of like how he talks about it. Like I almost would wonder, like for other atheists turned Christians, or other people looking at it, would be kind of almost more calming to think it's not like this like drastic change or anything, but almost just like something that continues and you keep moving forward step by step.
right.
And it's just a step before.
Yeah. And to some degree, he is likely writing this not just for adoring Christians, but for potential atheists, to say there's a very reasonable progression here. And I was a materialist. At one point, I was an occultist. At another point, there's these tensions, and you remember that Screwtape talks about if we can ever figure out how to make the materialist magician, we'll have one, right? So that's both those dark impulses and Lewis brought together, but he is trying to show that the move from his boyish faith or religion to atheism and then back to a theism and then Christianity itself has some steps, and in part comes from recognizing the not depravity, but maybe the emptiness of some of the philosophies that had led him there in the first place, and certainly the philosophies of the day, of his day, and some of the assumptions behind it. As he started to catch something new, he was awakening to this new thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Almost like, I mean, I'm just speaking from what I've heard Christians talk about it, and I've read lots of books, so
Sure.
it's almost like I hear that statement like, then my journey almost began
Right.
when they become a Christian.
Yeah.
He's talking about it almost like a part of his Christian walk was that part of atheism, and like being
Yes.
separate from God was almost
Yeah.
a part of that journey with God. Because God's never far from you.
The
So
interesting thing about what you said is the last chapter is marked the beginning,
yeah,
is the title. So he does see it as a beginning, but we have to remember for Lewis, both heaven and hell work backwards, right? So what you just said is quite true because he's looking back, and through the lens of faith, he can see that God has always been active.
yeah,
And so heaven is literally working backwards in his own story.
yeah. That's just. I mean, I didn't read all the way to the end, obviously, but I was just saying, based off what he said now, it kind of seems like it's just part of his journey. It's not like
Mhm.
my journey began when I became a Christian. It's
That's
kinda
right.
like
Yeah.
my journey has always been
Yeah.
to get to that point.
Yeah.
Of death, I guess.
Yes. Yeah. And it
I
doesn't,
think,
yeah, go ahead.
no, go ahead then.
I was just going to say, I agree that that it doesn't, his becoming a Christian doesn't then negate everything up to that point.
Yeah.
It is, everything up to that point is now seen in the new light of faith.
I think that's like very plausible for anyone. Like, I mean, personally, I've always been a Christian my whole life and raised a Christian.
Yeah.
And don't see myself changing.
Yeah.
But I guess for other people who may have experienced time in life where they wouldn't consider themselves like a Christian, it's like you shouldn't just compartmentalize that part of your life as like a dark path or past or something. Like that was still who you were and how you developed as a person. And like, I don't know, I think that's interesting to write it as like just a part of your faith journey instead of a separate life, I guess.
Mhm. Yeah, it's good.
That's kind of what I was going to say, something similar, that I think quite often it's kind of presented like when you become a Christian, it's like a whole new life and it's a new beginning, and you do start to feel bad about your past and think you have to kind of get rid of it somehow, or as opposed to this idea that this is your just another part of your life. And I think in some ways that's a better way of presenting it and thinking about it,
Mhm.
and that we can do a disservice, I think, to some new Christians by not giving them that kind of perspective.
Yes.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I remember in seminary, one of the things that we talked about in church history was that there is this period coming out of the Reformation where crisis was required, right? Like even if you were kind of born in the church, baptized as an infant, raised up, you still had to go through this crisis in order to reach faith. And so even John Wesley is a great example, because John Wesley is raised by a minister, an Anglican minister is his dad, and then on his mom's side, her father was a dissenting pastor, and so this really big faith formation. And John took his faith seriously. When his brother Charles was at Oxford, John was the head of Charles, and Charles was a part of this holy club that included George Whitefield, and they invited John to come in, and John kind of took leadership, and there was nobody who took their faith more seriously than Wesley. And that's where the Methodist movement comes from. That was a derogatory term applied to them. This holiness club, that was a derogatory term applied to them. It was seen as enthusiasm, and enthusiasm in those days was the worst term. And then John has this call or vocation to go to the New World, to America, Georgia, to preach the gospel to the Indians. And so he sets out with this idea that they are just aching to hear the good news. He's going to preach it. They're going to just be coming in droves. He gets there, reality hits, not very much interest. He has to work really hard to get a work going there. He has a run-in with a woman who he believed treated him false. And he basically has to flee America. He has to jump ship and flee because there's a warrant out for his arrest, because he refused to serve her communion when she became engaged to another man. And to do that publicly at the time was to call her reputation into question. So her father was suing him. It was going to put him under arrest. So he jumps on a ship and he goes back. He's on ship with Moravians, which are German people coming from the Quietist movement, again, part of the Reformation. And the ship hits some bad weather, and he's just thinking, I'm going to die. And he's freaking out. And these Moravians are calm and praying, and Wesley is just floored. And so he goes to them and he says, how is it that you are so calm in the face of what might be certain death? And they said, well, because we know our faith. If we were to die, we would be Christ. And they said, do you not know that Christ has died for you? And he says, I know that Christ has died for the sins of the world so that they might be saved. And they said, well, do you not know that he has died for you and forgiven your sins? And Wesley writes in his journal, I said yes, but I probably should have said no. But he gets home and he's having this wrestling of conscience. Now, this is part of that pattern, right? This is what you wanted, to go through some sort of crisis. So now he's got this crisis of faith. He goes to Aldersgate, this Moravian get together, and they are reading the preface of Martin Luther's commentary on the book of Romans. So boring. And as the reader is reading the preface, Wesley records, as I listened, my heart was strangely warm, and I thought, Christ has forgiven my sins and has saved me, even me. So, question for historians becomes, church historians, was Wesley always a Christian? Did Wesley become a Christian in that moment?
Mm.
So you'll have arguments on both sides. There will be those that say, no, Wesley was always a Christian, and this is a renewal of his faith. And to quote Victor Shepherd, before Wesley comes to embrace the gospel of salvation by faith alone, there was nobody who was as disciplined in Christendom as Wesley. After he has that experience, there is no one as disciplined in Christendom as Wesley.
Right.
So was he always a Christian? Did he have this Christian moment? So that's part of this kind of idea, right? And from that, we can be sometimes inheritors of that kind of a pattern, right? I've had conversations where people are like, yeah, but you have to have this moment of
Yes.
crisis. You haven't murdered somebody before becoming a Christian. If you haven't struggled with doubts, is your Christianity real?
Billy Graham's wife kind of wrestles with that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's part of the story is
Yeah,
he's
yeah.
out there preaching and she's going, well, I don't know if I've ever had that experience.
Right,
I just don't remember
right,
not
right.
believing or not knowing
Yeah.
it, or
Yeah.
I don't remember it before.
Yeah. And you see it in
Very different.
Pilgrim's Progress, even Wesley's own preaching, right? He started out in the field preaching was to flee the wrath that is to come. That was not salvific. That was an awakening sermon to get people to come to the society to hear the sermon about salvation. And they would. So anyways, all that to say, Isaiah, you're and my mom, you're quite right that we do disservice, because then there's people. I remember we had a church family at Good Shepherd who their oldest son said, I don't have a good testimony. I've always loved Jesus. I've grown up loving Jesus. I haven't wavered in my confidence in Jesus. And the idea, to me, coming to Christianity the way that I did, that was heartbreaking, because why is his fidelity in God's faithfulness not a better story than, I murdered my first person at the age of 8 and then Jesus saved me, right? Why is that a better story than God has always been present and has brought me through and has maintained my faith, and by the grace of God, I've kept my confidence in Christ.
I would agree with that, because I guess, I mean, going to camp and stuff, you hear all these people tell their stories, and I always kind of felt like when I'm saying it's kind of pointless, because I'm just gonna say like, yeah, I just always had a faith in him, and like I've had encounters of like seeing Jesus and like seeing angels and stuff. So my faith as a child was unwavering. Like I physically saw it.
Yeah.
And so to me, it was like very real. And I always talked about it with my parents. So it was really hard when I went to camp and heard people. I was like, well, mine's kind of lame
Right.
because I don't have this like coming to Christ story or like,
Yeah.
oh man, I had all these doubts and stuff and all these things bother me and pull me away. And I could see that being like a problem for that crisis idea. Like somebody told me you need to have a crisis, I'd be like, well, I just don't. I just
Right.
always believed.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know. I
Yeah.
agree.
I had lots of crises in my life, but none of them were ever coincided with faith changes.
Right.
The experiences, the sort of standout experiences in my faith journey have been lovely. The crises have been crummy, but I can't remember when I didn't absolutely believe in God.
Yeah.
Total faith in Jesus from, well, I just can't remember when. There never was a time
Yeah.
when I didn't. And I see my story as not, I think all of us go on a life that starts and it goes through until it ends. And some of us have different patterns, but I don't think that my life before, I wouldn't know when to put my life before.
Yeah.
An experience when I was 10. Should I do it then? Should I do it when I was 26? Should I do it when I was called into ministry? I mean, I don't know.
Right.
Each one of them has deepened and expanded my faith.
Yeah. Well, and for me, having understood Lewis talking about the way heaven works backwards, I've learned to read my own story through that lens. That, I mean, there was certainly a crisis moment at age 21. There was certainly a giving of my heart at age 6. But I also see the continuity of God's presence and faithfulness throughout the whole story. Sorry, age of 4. I tend to say 4 to 6 because I'm never quite sure
Yeah,
exactly.
you were 4 years old. Yeah. But can you talk a little bit about heaven working backwards? You said that earlier about heaven and hell working backwards, and that's probably the week I missed on the Great Divorce.
Yeah, so it does come out in Great Divorce. So the idea is, there's this bus trip from hell into heaven. And
Yeah, I
so
read the
as,
I've read the book.
yeah,
but
yeah.
I missed the, yeah, okay.
I just have to set the context for you.
All right, fine.
So as Lewis, as the character Lewis is having the conversation with the character McDonald in the heavenly scape, they have this conversation in which hell is almost non-existent. I mean, the smallest grain of heaven could not fit into it because it is so infinitesimal in size. And so the McDonald character says, for those who decide not to leave hell, to just go back to it, like that this is just a day trip, they will have always said that they have always been in hell. For those who stay in heaven and go further in and take possession of it, they will look back and say that that was purgatory or the first steps of heaven. But then it even goes beyond that, right? Because it's this idea that what is permanent is the only real reality, right? Hell has no permanency to it. So those who choose heaven, it's redemptive. It moves in a redeeming way, right? So like even Lewis in this book can look back at his story and see how God is at work. He can be gracious to his father. He can, he can tell the truth. So that's what
Right, okay.
Yeah.
And actually, you just touched on something else that struck me when I was reading about it, reading the book, is he actually has always been a kind, thoughtful, I don't want to use the word good person,
Yeah.
but I mean, yes, focused on himself and that sort of thing, although he had his relationship with his brother. But in a lot of ways, he was a decent chap, we'll say.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Most people are.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah.
It's true. I think about some of the things like my reaction to his father, and that's probably just colored by my own past. I'd be avoiding that guy like the plague.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
You wouldn't
Did
find me sitting in the garden reading.
we brought up the Great Divorce and the bus tour. Did you notice that his conversion comes while riding a bus,
On a bus. Yeah.
sitting on top of the
Yeah.
bus?
Gonna go with this. He says, and notice here how the true training for anything, whatever that is good, always prefigures and, if submitted to, will always help us in the true training for the Christian life.
Right.
That is a school where they can always use your previous work, whatever subject it was on.
Yeah.
In that it was always was
Yeah.
headed in the same direction.
Yes. Yes.
Like, yeah, heaven works backwards idea. I prefer that versus like the now I am on my journey or something.
Yeah.
Like it's always has been your journey to heaven.
And there's not, I mean, we also want to be careful that we don't, right? Because remember with screw tape, the devil always attacks in pairs. So we always have to defend on two sides. We don't want to make things so amorphous that we don't recognize the moments when grace breaks in, because there are moments, right?
Yeah.
Like I can describe at 21, Christ laying a hold of me, and that was significant and important. And even here, Lewis can untangle the threads to say, I don't know exactly, but I was on the way to the zoo. I wasn't a Christian. I got to the zoo. I was, and I don't remember thinking or anything, but there was this moment. And even in biblical history, the significant moments when God breaks in, the people will normally erect an Ebenezer, right? A pillar of stones to mark out the event and the place. Think of the stairway of Jacob. I met God in this place, put up some stones, because you want to take that seriously. It's important to remember. And then historically, right, as this is the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob. And that's not just a general description, but this is that same God who called Abraham from his father's house to this land that he would show him. He then made his promise to his son, and then made a promise to his son, and worked in his life and did these things. This is our God too, right? So there is something significant of those moments that you described, right? I have seen Jesus. I have encountered angels, and it's good to remember that, because as Lewis talks about in other places, the peaks and the valleys, right? We need the peaks in order to help us get through the valleys. So those markings are important. I remember when I had my call to pastoral ministry in 2005, I was working with a Christian counselor who said, you should really get an object that you can associate with that. So if that memory fades, you have that thing that it's an Ebenezer, the touch point that you can say, I remember that. I remember the moment that God called me, God spoke to me, that was real. So don't throw out those moments, just don't make them everything, right? Yeah. Sorry, I didn't preach last week, so I got to preach about stuff. How's our time? Okay, 8:11. Um. So you remember in Mere Christianity, he talked about being a Christian does not mean that you have to cast off all other religions. So something that happens for Lewis as he begins to move down this road where he recognizes a mind, the absolute, and then the spirit, and then theism, God, is that he comes to it through paganism. So he recognizes in these pagan myths that there's something there. And he says, where in the world religions, because in the last section, last week when we talked about it, there is this, on what basis do I say that all religions are false except for Christianity? So now he comes and it is a conversation partner that says something just in passing that he catches that historically this dying God happens. And so as he looks at these different myths, Greek, Roman, Norse, and he sees the cycle in the pagan mythology, because it's part of the annual cycle of nature, right? Things die, and then in spring it rises again, right? And there's a god associated with that. So he says, I see this. Where do I see it fulfilled? And so it's Christianity. And he says, same again with Mere Christianity. There's kind of, as I look at it, there's two possibilities: Christianity or Hinduism. Hinduism has these two marks against it. But for me, Christianity is the fulfillment of all other religions, of these paganisms, of these mythologies. It's the maturity of it all. And that becomes this moment of unlocking, when everything, Michael Ward, I think that's what his name was, in his Planet Narnia, points out, Lewis talks about Christianity isn't the thing that you see. Like you don't look into the sun. The sun is the light by which all else is revealed. That's how Christianity worked for Lewis. When it clicked home, it was like the sun, not that you stare at, but everything else is illuminated by it, right? So that's the way in which Christianity then made sense for him. But yeah, he engages George MacDonald. So this is Guns and Good Company. He goes to war. And he doesn't have much to say about it, but God continues to reach him. And now he's reading, I just saw his name.
Do we know, did he
Yes,
fight in the
Captain.
Second World War as well?
No, he did not. Just in the First World War. And then I want you to notice too, just because we're running out of time, when he has this moment of conversion on the bus, and that might be in Checkmate. I mentioned to my mom and my mom, 1922. So when I read that this morning, I went, that was 100 years ago.
Oh,
And I kind of went, whoa, that's kind of crazy. 100 years ago, he finished the grapes. Anyways, on that bus, as he moves imperceptibly into being a Christian, he describes it as this sudden thaw from winter to spring. And I totally heard the theme of Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
Yeah.
Right. And
Yeah.
and the captivity, the atheism, always winter and never Christmas, right? So the harsh barrenness without the joy that he describes here. And joy plays a part, right? So this whole book is about this stabs of joy and that kind of thing. And he recognizes suddenly that it's not joy itself that he wants. It's actually joy itself is pointing away from itself to a source. And at this point, he's moving towards theism, right? So not Christianity. So, but he's been thinking about a what. He's starting to think about a who. He had a nice little discussion about the incarnation too, talking about Hamlet and Shakespeare. It's on page 264 of mine. Let me just find that footnote. So even if my own philosophy were true, how could the initiative lie on my side? My own analogy, as I now first perceived, suggested the opposite. If Shakespeare and Hamlet could ever meet, it must be Shakespeare's doing. Hamlet could initiate nothing. And then in the footnote, he says Shakespeare could, in principle, make himself appear as author within the play and write a dialogue between Hamlet and himself. The Shakespeare, in quotes, within the play would, of course, be at once Shakespeare and one of Shakespeare's creatures. It would bear some analogy to incarnation. I just loved that. I thought that was a really good insight. And of course, like all analogies, it does fall apart, but like all analogies, it can be a helpful thing to keep in mind and keep in tension. And so he starts to pray to this God. Though he's not yet ready to walk by himself. And so at the end of chapter 14, I was hearing a little bit, again, great divorce, unable to walk on the grass. The prodigal son at least walked home on his own feet. But who can duly adore that love, which will open the high gates to a prodigal who is brought in kicking, struggling, resentful, and darting his eyes in every direction for a chance of escape? The hardness, but properly understood, they plumb the depth of the divine mercy. The hardness of God is kinder than the softness of men, and his compulsion is our liberation. So that's kind of the final picture in Great Divorce of the chessboard. Is this the truth? How does this determination and free will work together? And for Lewis, he gets a glimpse that he tries to describe of how it can work together, that he both needed that dragging in, and yet it was still his own action, and he was responsible. So he talks about this movement to Christianity as being the most unclear, even though it was the most recent. And I really liked some of the things that he had to say here about the nature of heaven and hell. And I recognize some of my own theology being highly covered through this. Thus, heaven and hell come in. But it may well be that to think much of either, except in this context of thought, to hypostatize them as if they had a substantial meaning apart from the presence or absence of God, corrupts the doctrine of both and corrupts us while we so think of them. So I thought that's how I think about heaven and hell. And I thought I was being an original thinker. Turns out I just read Lewis a long time ago. But that's one of my criticisms of a lot of Christianity is they think of these places in static terms apart from the presence of God. And really, it's all about the presence of God. To be with the presence of God is itself heaven, and to be apart from or separated is
Mhm.
itself hell.
So I hear that better connects for me than that like Jesus saying like the kingdom of heaven is now, is here.
Yes.
That connects those two better than that idea of like
Oh,
this
yes.
separate place that is so disconnected from us
That's
here
right.
now.
Yes.
You kind of, well, how could Jesus say the kingdom of heaven is here? Because that's heaven.
Right.
That has nothing to do with.
That's right. So heaven itself is simply God's the God dimension of reality, right? It's not a separate location or paradise. I mean, heaven is only paradise because that is where God resides, right? That is the God
Mhm.
dimension of reality. And the promise of the book of Revelation, as we saw, is the removal of the veil that separates now heaven and earth, where the two will be one and the same, right? And we'll have this heaven on earth, heaven and earth united in Christ fully without that veil, which is why we don't no longer will need sun, moon, or temple, because God, Christ, will rule and his presence will be with us unmediated. We will have access, right? We have the beatific vision. So that's the Catholic Church, right? We will see God as we are seen. In the Reformation, we will know God as we are known. And Wesley, we will love God as we are loved. All those three can work together, right? Because there's no separation. We would truly be in heaven, even though we have not abandoned or fled the earth. The earth is simply renewed, even as the heavens are renewed. Hallelujah. He's finally taking out of himself. And maybe gets rid of his diary. A lot of screw tapes suggestions for corrupting his patient, Wormwood's patient, using the very real members of the church. We can see that here. For him, churchmanship was wholly unattractive. He only went initially because he felt that it was important to fly your flag. You know, if this is who you are, then put it up, kind of thing. We also see some of his characters, the clergymen that no longer believed as we go.
Yeah.
And
And there's another character. Oh, wait, I guess that's the same one where he just wants to have a part of himself
yes,
in heaven.
yeah.
So that again, that reminiscent of a character in the Great Divorce.
Yeah. I know very well when, but hardly how the final step was taken. I was driven to Whipsnade one Sunday morning. When we set out, I did not believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And when we reached the zoo, I did. Yet I had not exactly spent the journey in thought, nor in great emotion. Emotional is perhaps the last word we can apply to some of the most important events. It was more like when a man, after long sleep, still lying motionless in bed, becomes aware that he is now awake. And it was like that moment on top of the bus, ambiguous, freedom or necessity, or do they differ at their maximum? At the maximum, a man is what he does. There is nothing of him left over or outside the act. As for what we commonly call will and what we commonly call emotion, I fancy these usually talk too loud, protest too much to be quite believed, and we have a secret suspicion that the great passion or the iron resolution is partly a put-up job. So in conclusion of joy, he says, I cannot indeed complain like Wordsworth that the visionary gleam has passed away. I believe that the old stab, the old bitter sweet has come to me as often as sharply since my conversion as at any time in my life, whatever. But I know now that the experience considered as a state of my mind had never had the kind of importance I once gave it. It was valuable only as a pointer to something other and outer. While that other was in doubt, the pointer naturally loomed large in my thoughts. When we are lost in the woods, the sight of a signpost is a great matter. He who first sees it cries, "Look!" The whole party gathers round and stares. But when we have found the road and are passing signposts every few miles, we shall not stop and stare. They will encourage us, and we shall be grateful to the authority that set them up, but we shall not stop and stare, or not much. Not on this road, though the pillars are of silver and their lettering gold, we would be at Jerusalem. Not, of course, that I don't often catch myself stopping to stare at roadside objects of even less importance. The end. So in the end for him, joy is part of the awakening, but ultimately joy is not the thing itself. Joy points to the source of joy. And so when he lays hold of that source, or better, that source lays hold of him, then he is not looking for joy. He's not on the watch for it because he has the very thing to which it points. And so he continues to have the experience and can appreciate that experience, but not as an event or a thing in and of itself, but merely as the keep going further up and further in, the reap-a-cheap of the moment of coming to find God.
Yeah.
Well, my friends, the next 3 weeks, the final book, till we have Faces, a Greek myth retold. I even heard a little bit of that in this bad boy. This is my favorite Lewis book. And I hope that you enjoyed as much as I do. So I'm going to stop the recording and then we can pray.